Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. Despite weathering a pandemic, rising inflation, and increased use of alternative routes to employability, a new study by Edward Jones found that 55% of Americans have not changed their opinions regarding the importance of saving for higher education. While education savings remains a high priority, many Americans are leaving money on the table by not leveraging critical saving strategies, such as 529s. Strengthening overall financial resilience is a critical component to alleviating cost concerns around education expenses. Additionally, nearly half of Americans say they do not feel like they're saving enough to cover their future education expenses. Among those who are less likely to consider changing their future education plans, the cost of higher education was a primary factor, followed by inflation and COVID-19. This underscores the need for consumers to assess their complete financial picture. To help us understand all of the economic landscape and its impact on education and discuss some ways to lessen this impact on regular folks like you and me, today we welcome Steve Rueschhoff, principal at Edward Jones Financial Company. Welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you.
No, it's wonderful that you were able to carve out some time for us today, especially now at this time when families are planning to send their kids off to college and just trying to make that next step in their lives academically. I think this is a really timely piece to begin. So thank you again for coming on.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be with you.
One question I do have, and maybe you can share this with us, is what is the approximate cost of tuition or even average cost of tuition today?
Kevin, as you mentioned, Edward Jones has completed our 11th annual study on 529 plan awareness and really uncovered some fascinating insights. You mentioned it in the opening that the majority of Americans still identify saving for education as a high priority, and this is in spite of weathering the pandemic and market volatility and contending with high inflation. In spite of these headwinds, savings for education remains a high priority for 55% of Americans. That's actually up a little bit from the survey we did in 2021. And it's no surprise because college costs are high, and so the need to save for this number is really high. So college costs can range from anywhere from $100,000 for a four-year college education on up to $300,000 for a four-year education, which varies based on a number of factors. But that's a big number, Kevin. And so saving for that cost is really important.
No, I agree that is a really large number. And I would assume that $100,000 number, again, is over the course of 4 years. That's more would that be for a private school or for a public school?
So the $100,000 would be more like a public school. That would be in-state tuition, room and board, things like that. That's going to be on the lower end of the spectrum. But if you get to out-of-state tuition, the cost of some private schools, that's where the number goes up, and you can reach $30,000 or higher for a four-year education. So it really varies based on a number of factors.
Right. And what do we think is the projected, increase year to year? Because I know from 2019 to now, the increase was about 2 or 3% per year. Can we expect those types of increases going forward?
I think it's prudent when you're saving for education to assume some inflation rate. It's kind of interesting because we're all dealing with inflation right now with food and travel costs and gas and things like that. But Americans have actually been experiencing college tuition inflation costs for years. And you're right, that inflation rate is ranged kind of from 1% to 3%. And it's really prudent when you're thinking about future college costs to assume that it's going to continue to go up at some level in the future.
Now, of course, we began the conversation, and I began in the open talking about or mentioning the 529 savings plans. But before we actually get into that, I want to find out what is usually the primary way that people look to finance their children's educations.
What we found in our research is that Americans are using just regular savings accounts as a tool to save for education. Some aren't able to save at all. Some are hoping for financial aid or scholarships. But regular savings is something that Americans are using to save for education. And that can be fine, but I think it's more about the investments behind those savings, and are you putting your money to good work, given your risk tolerance, your time horizon, saving for college. Sometimes that can be an 18-year or longer time horizon. And so taking a little bit of risk, investing in equities and fixed income securities is a way to help, achieve your savings goals versus just, say, a CD or something like that from a bank.
Now, of course, you mentioned a lot of different tools there that I'm sure some parents may not be completely versed in when we start talking about not just stocks and bonds, but all the other things as well. So, and we won't necessarily dive into the weeds in those areas today in this program. But for those parents that may be dreaming of the full ride scholarship, and I think that's what everybody wants. That's like the holy grail of education, or educational finance, to get that full ride scholarship. But if their children aren't going to get that, whether it's academically or even athletically, what are some of the other options available to families to help to fund their education?
So we already talked about how Americans have identified or expressed the importance of savings for education. The majority of Americans believe this is really important, and it's a high priority in spite of all the other things tugging at their need for discretionary spending. But in spite of that need, 2/3 of Americans could not identify a 529 plan as a savings tool for saving for education costs. And that's really a shame, Kevin. They're leaving money on the table because they're missing out on some important tax benefits that can stretch their savings dollars even further.
So, let's go ahead and get into it now then. What exactly is a 529 savings plan, and how can people get access to it? Is this a state-by-state type of plan, or is it a federal program? What is a 529 plan?
529 plan is a state-sponsored savings plan. The numbers 529 represent the tax code that was carved out for special tax treatment for this plan. Each state offers their own 529 plan. You can use your state's plan to save for education costs, but you don't have to. You can really choose any state plan in saving for 529. And we mentioned some of the tax benefits of a 529 plan. And the way that works is contributions go in. Contributions are after-tax dollars that go into the plan. The investment earnings in the plan are tax-deferred and potentially tax-free if used for qualifying education costs. And in addition to that, some states allow deduction of contribution from your income taxes. So when you're contributing up to limits, your state may allow a deduction of state income tax for your 529 plan contributions. So there's really a lot of important benefits that can help the consumer when they're saving for education costs.
Is there a particular cap on how much a family can contribute to that 529 plan per year?
So there are some limits, Kevin, and it varies. The typical limit that you would think of or hear of is $16,000 per person per gift. So let's say a husband and wife are setting up a 529 plan for their child. That'd be $16,000 gifted on the behalf of the beneficiary, which is the child, for the husband. $16,000 gifted on behalf of the wife to the child, so that's $32,000 per year, and that's generally the limit. That's an annual limit for contributing to 529 plans. There's also some maximum limits that vary by state, and so state rules would limit the total amount that can be contributed to a 529 plan over the life of that plan per beneficiary And it ranges by state. That can be $235,000 for some states on up to $500,000 to other states.
Oh, so then that's...
In addition to those annual limits, those limits can be accelerated as well. So there's a 5-year acceleration that can be done in the event that a larger contribution can be made in 1 year. You can take those annual limits that I mentioned, those $16,000 per person per gift, and those can be accelerated in the year of giving as a way to offer increased flexibility.
Okay, I think that sounds really good. So what we're actually talking really big numbers now, because if a family if they have the means, they can contribute up to, again, like $16,000 per person. So you get 2 people contribute. Now, is there a maximum number of people who can match that? So you have the mother and father. Now let's say you also may have an aunt or a grandparent who wants to contribute as well. Are they able to contribute at that same maximum number, or does the overall cap now come into play?
Yes, in fact, they are. So an owner creates a plan and sets up a plan on behalf of the beneficiary. So the beneficiary would be the future student. And the beneficiary doesn't have to be related to the owner. So the most typical example, the one that I mentioned, was a mother and father setting up a plan for their beneficiary child. But that beneficiary could be a niece or nephew. It could be a grandchild. It can even be your friend's child. So the beneficiary doesn't have to be related to the owner of the plan. And so to your point, Kevin, or your question, the parents could be saving on behalf of that child. The grandparents could be contributing on behalf of the child. Friends, relatives could be contributing to 529 plans. So it offers additional flexibility for these types of savings vehicles.
So that might actually sound like a good plan for families to think about for birthdays now. Instead of having these gifts, elaborate gifts being given, the physical gifts being given for birthdays, they can ask for contributions to their child's 529 plan in its stead.
A great suggestion, Kevin, and we see a lot of that. Our financial advisors at Edward Jones see a lot of that, where grandparents are gifting to 529 plans on behalf of the grandchildren, and it helps fund their future education costs.
Now, I know you mentioned that each state has its own 529 plan. So let's say as a person living in New York, and I'm setting up a 529 plan for my child who obviously also lives in New York, but they decide to go to a school that is outside of New York. How would I then be able to use that money? Would I have to transfer it to the state that he's going to, or can I just pull it out here and still use it for that school, that even though it's out of state?
You do not need to transfer it to a different 529 plan. That's additional flexibility that these 529 plans offer, is that you can go to any college in any state. So in your example, you saved for the New York 529 plan, but your child could go to Berkeley, which is in California, and you could use the savings to pay for those educational costs in California, and there's no need to change the plan to do that. There's a lot of flexibility as long as it's qualifying educational costs. So things like funds, tuition, room and board, books, even computers, that's a qualifying distribution from a 529 plan, and that preserves the tax benefits of that plan. If you use it for a non-qualified distribution, so let's say I just pulled money out to buy a car or put a down payment on a car, that's a non-qualified distribution, and there's tax penalties for that kind of a non-qualifying distribution. The earnings are taxed as ordinary income, and there's a 10% penalty tax. So that's where you've got to really be aware and ensure that you're using these for education costs and not for other purposes, because there could be tax penalties associated with distributions for other purposes.
Okay, so let me just summarize this really quickly, and correct me if I leave anything out. So a qualified education expense would be obviously tuition. We're looking at room and board as well, probably books and fees, lab supplies that they may need for school as well. Anything else that I might be missing? Because I know that at different schools, they come up with all these different expenses and fees that are associated with college. So we just want to make sure that nothing is left out, that the students will be able to cover whatever it is that they need to cover. Anything
relating to that education would be a qualifying expense. Now, your listener should each consult their own tax professional to be sure about the specific details that they're working with. But let's say you wanted to buy your child a laptop for use in college. That laptop could be used, the proceeds from a 529 distribution could be used to purchase equipment like a laptop. And so far we've been talking about college education, but the great thing about 529 plans is there's additional flexibility for other types of education as well. It can be used for college tuition and college costs, but it can also be used to fund K through 12 education, trade schools, apprenticeships, even repaying student loan debt. So that speaks to the flexibility behind a 529 savings plan.
Hold that thought right there, because I actually want to come back and revisit that as soon on the other side of our little break here. You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is Steve Rueschhoff, principal at Edward Jones. And today we are talking about how to increase and to pay for your college education. So I want to get back to that last point you just made about the flexibility, or going back into the flexibility of the 529s. You can use this to actually pay off other college tuitions that you may have, or college debt that you may have incurred earlier.
That's correct, Kevin. When we talk about the flexibility for a 529 plan, I'm going to talk about that in two ways. The first way is, what can the distributions be used for and be considered a qualifying distribution from a 529, so preserves the tax benefit? And then who can use those distribution proceeds? So first on the what, we've been talking a lot about saving for college education costs, and when people think about saving for future education, that's the most common consideration. But it can also be used not just for college costs, but K through 12 education, private tuition for elementary school, private tuition for high school, trade school tuition, apprenticeships, or up to limits, even repaying student loan debt that the beneficiary may have. So there's a wide range of flexibility in terms of what's considered a qualifying distribution for a 529 plan. The additional flexibility comes in for who the beneficiary is of a 529 plan. The beneficiary of a 529 can be designated and changed for any reason, and as I mentioned before, it doesn't even have to be related. You could have a 529 plan set up for child number one. They use some of the proceeds. You then change the beneficiary to child number two, uses some of the proceeds, and you can even then, after that child, change the beneficiary to, say, yourself, because you're bored in retirement and you want to go get your MBA, or you want to repay off some of your student debt that you still got hanging over your head. You can change the beneficiary to yourself and use the 529 plan for that, and it preserves the tax benefits for those uses. So there's a lot of flexibility inherent in these plans.
So let me for those for people out there who may not be parents just yet, and they want to start thinking about this, because this is something that I did as well. If I were to get a 529 in my name, and I don't have children yet, so I got it as myself as the beneficiary, and then now later on I do have children, I can then shift the beneficiary to my child using the same plan, or would I have to open up a whole new account?
It's correct. You could change the beneficiary. So you could start with yourself as the beneficiary, and you could change the beneficiary later to your child. You could even change the beneficiary to your friend's child or your niece or your nephew. It doesn't have to be related to you. Okay,
again, I think that's a really good thing for people to know out there, that they can actually start this even before they have children, so that they can begin celebrate or saving for their these expenses, because college expenses, I don't think, are going to get cheaper. I think they're going to get more expensive as we go, as opposed to getting less expensive.
Right, Kevin. College, as we talked about, the number for college is high. It's $100,000 to $300,000 today for a 4-year education. But if you're considering private K through 12 education, there's additional costs there. And so starting to save early and using the power of compound interest to help you save could be a benefit for certain people.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Edward Jones had done a survey regarding these 529 plan awareness. So what did the I guess, the survey actually reveal? What were some of the barriers that kept people from knowing about these 529s?
Some of the barriers were, first of all, lack of awareness. That's one of the reasons we do this survey, Kevin, and we're so passionate about helping educate Americans around the benefit of things like 529 plans and starting to save early for future education costs. So lack of awareness was one of the big benefits, or the barriers, I should say. The other is just lack of the ability to save, not being sure where to start or how much to save. These were all identified barriers for saving.
And we talk about some of the, I guess, not being sure of what to start with. What would be a minimum amount, or is there a minimum that people can contribute to a 529 or other plan?
The minimum is going to vary by state, by the state plan that you're using. It may vary by financial services firm that you're working with. One of the best things people can do if they're not sure is get the help of a financial advisor, like one of the 18,000 plus that we have at Edward Jones, because they can help consumers. First of all, they will advise you on the trade-offs of saving for retirement versus your discretionary spending versus saving for education. They can help advise on the trade-offs and kind of helping you dial in what's the right amount to save for each goal. They can help determine if a 529 plan is right for you as an individual in your tax situation. And they can help you set up a plan if you want. So if it is right for you and you want to get started, they can help you with the paperwork and doing that as well. So working with a qualified financial advisor is one of the best ways to get started and get educated.
And what is we're talking about New York specifically, but what would be the, I guess, return on investment for a 529 here in New York?
The return on investment for a 529 plan, whether it's New York or any other state, is going to depend on a lot of factors. First, the saver should consider their time horizon, their tolerance for risk, and that can inform what kind of investment choices are made in the plan. So it's largely dependent upon the time horizon, the risk tolerance, the embedded costs in the plan. So those are all going to be factors in terms of what the expected investment return will be.
Okay, and
and I think, as we all know, we're experiencing this in 2022. There's going to be market volatility generally associated with investments in stocks and bonds, and that's where a financial advisor can help guide you, help you stay invested, because generally this is savings over a long time horizon, and so weathering that volatility is an important part of achieving your savings goal.
So therefore, I guess, should we treat a opening a 529 plan or savings plan very similar to a retirement plan, meaning you get started, the earlier you get started, the better, and that you have a much longer window to operate from? Or does it matter when you get in?
Really, when you're talking about any savings goal, the earlier you start, the better, because you've got the power of compound interest, or the magic of compound interest on your side, which takes a while to build up and work for you. So generally speaking, the earlier you start saving, the better. But everybody's situation is going to be different. And so some people will save once a year. Some will have the ability to put in a lump sum every 5 years. Some may do that monthly versus annually. It just varies so much on your situation, your cash flow, and what makes sense for the individual.
So is there with all that into consideration, would there actually be an ideal window or ideal span of time for somebody to decide to open up a 529?
I think what you did, Kevin, is prudent. I certainly did that before we had children, so I started saving for my daughter early. And now she's age 14, and I can see that investment has grown over time because I was diligent about putting money in each year. That's really the best thing to do, is put it aside early and often, work with a qualified professional like a financial advisor to help you determine that target level of goal that you're trying to reach, and then back into the monthly or annual savings that goes in. It can be a complex calculation because there is flexibility in a 529 plan, but knowing how much to save and the amount varies based on a lot of things. Is this for one child or multiple? Is this for college education costs or elementary? Are they going to a public in-state tuition or out-of-state tuition private school? So there's a lot of factors that vary into kind of that targeted savings amount. And that's why working with a qualified professional can be helpful, because they can really help you budget the right kind of savings amount that fits your needs.
So I guess that almost kind of answers my next question then. So if I didn't have that 18-year period of time to save for my child's education, and I just came onto the scene and just became aware of 529s with 5 or 6 years to go before my child graduates, is there something that can I still take advantage of the 529 or some other type of financial instrument that would help me out here?
Even in that situation, Kevin, the benefit of a 529 is going to be the tax benefits over and above some other savings vehicle. So that's always going to be, we can always count on death and taxes, right? So to the extent taxes are there in your investment returns, by using a 529, you're avoiding those taxes when used the right way. And so that will always be a help, because you're not going to have those taxes coming out and nicking your investment returns versus other vehicles. So even if someone is starting late and they're planning on savings, the 529 plan may make sense for that individual. And then, of course, there's other things that can offset some of the costs, like financial aid, applying for scholarships. You know, if you've got some generous relatives that can help save, that always helps too. So there's a lot of ways that you can help offset the cost.
And finally, where can our listeners go to get more information about 529 plans?
One of the best places they can go, as I mentioned, we've got 18,000 plus financial advisors at Edward Jones who are standing by, ready to help. If your listeners want to learn more, they can go to edwardjones.com/education savings. And that's a great place to get educated and to get started.
Well, thank you very much. And we would definitely like to thank our guest today, Steve Rueschhoff, principal at Edward Jones, for coming on to our show today.
Thank you, Kevin.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.